Yu-Gi-Oh! Is Polarizing, a game that's been jokingly referred to as a rock, paper, scissors game after a rock, paper, scissors game, or at least in Master Duels the second coin toss, whether it be going first and building powerful boards, at times unbreakable, or going second and opening the one card that just wipes out your opponent's board or intended play. Over the years, it's hard not to acknowledge the reputation of non-games that this particular game has seemingly gained notoriety for. In order to make my point for this video, I would like to go back to the early stages of the game. But first, if you're a fan of in-depth combo videos, new set coverage, and occasional fun stuff that we like to do on the channel, and potentially more discussions like this one, you can let me know by absolutely crushing those thumbs up and subscribe buttons, as they go a long way in supporting the channel and letting me know that you like content like this and would like to see more of it. In 2002, the first batch of cards was introduced to the TCG with the set Legend of Blue Eyes, a time when traps were more prevalent, high attack monsters were the meta, and players were both afforded multiple turns, but that didn't always guarantee interaction. Sometimes summoning out a Gemini Elf turn 1 was enough to cruise control a game, attacking over set monsters until the opponent drew into cards that didn't allow for them to stall, as the player with the Gemini Elf could slowly build up their boards and create a slow but surely victory or death depending on which side you were on. That wasn't always the case. Cards like Maneater Bug, or simply having a monster with 1500 attack paired with reinforcements, was enough to get over a potential obstacle and allow you to take on the offensive. Overall, it didn't take much for games to flip the tide, as there were multiple ways to do so with the afforded turns given via the nature and pacing of the game. It at least gave the illusion of a chance. Fast forward a little bit to 2005 in what's commonly known as GOAT format, and a ton of more powerful cards were released, with effect monsters becoming a bigger focal point in the game. After the release of Invasion of Chaos, players were introduced to much quicker ways to end games, whether it be summoning one of your Chaos Beatsticks and pairing it with cards like Brain Control and Call of the Haunted to quickly swarm the field and steal games from what felt like nowhere, or you could just see the Trinity and overwhelm your opponent through advantage as long as you had just a little bit of luck on your side. Shortly after, Yu-Gi-Oh! Would begin to forever change with the release of the Lightsworn archetype in 2008 for us in the TCG. Lightsworn was the first archetype and the first successful deck to have what felt like a coordinated game plan. Randomization was provided through whatever Lightsworn monsters were sent to the graveyard, and whatever the opening 5 was, which allowed a coordinated strategy to keep its identity within the game. That's without even mentioning tech choices that still gave a bit of variety to what you were seeing. In 2009 came along the introduction of Synchros, along with another powerful archetype, Blackwings. Unlike Lightsworn, Blackwings didn't focus on milling a ton of cards. Blackwings focused on high attack monsters, special summoning, and different ways to recruit each other, whether it be Black Whirlwind or Shura. Ultimately, this was a strategy that focused on synchro summoning but didn't feel quite as coordinated as a deck as Lightsworn, because you still had to draw your combo pieces in what was relatively slow-paced game. Lightsworns had multiple ways to send cards to the graveyard, even if your turn ended with just a normal summon. Synchro monsters also took 2+ monsters to make, which allowed the game to maintain its relatively slow pace. It wasn't until 2012 with Inzectors and Windups where we got our first 2 powerful archetypes that had coordinated endboards through common 2-card combos that focused on summoning out the more popular extra deck monsters of that time while making a sizable board. Windups changed their battle positions and special summoned, while Inzectors equipped, destroyed, and special summoned at a more consistent pace than anything that we had ever seen before them. One could argue that maybe Infernity did it first, though their impact wasn't quite as felt. A game that was predicated around a ton of powerful free agent cards quickly became a game about which theme and gimmick was the strongest. This era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was what I consider to be the pillar that turned modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Into the game that we now know today. Optimization, consistency, thematic deck building, and even hand traps, as back then we already had cards like Maxi, Effect Veiler, Droll Lockbird, and DD Crow. Some were more used than others, a familiar remark if you play Modern. As the years went on, cards continued to get stronger, as did archetypes. Some of the generic card design was scaled back a little bit. Things like the Trinity from GOAT format remain extremely powerful to this day, and it really wasn't until 2014 where we'd see Konami experiment with making insanely powerful cards but at that time we got Spellbook of Judgment and the Dragon Rulers. I don't want to spend too much time on them though, as those were just two more archetypes that heightened the power ceiling with their own respective theme. The same can be said about everything from DUAA, known as Duelist Alliance, until 2016. Things like Towers and Clifford, which I didn't even mention the introduction of the pendulum mechanic, but that's not even really the purpose of this video. We got Card of Demise shortly after the OCG would get the Grass Looks Greener in the same year. Slowly but surely, with the power of themes increasing, Konami was experimenting with printing generic insane cards again. Fast forward to 2017, and Alistair was pairing itself with a ton of hand trap, like the newly released Ash Blossom at the time. True Draco gave the player base PTSD with Card of Demise, grass decks started forming, and let's not forget Zodiac, what was widely considered to be the best deck of all time, above the likes of Dragon Ruler and Spellbooks for its ability to make a full board off of one of its own monsters, allowing the deck to play loads of generic cards with it to counteract other strategies. In a game some people thought was spinning out of control in regards to power, Konami made their own power move with the release of Master Rule 4. Master Rule 4 would take the coordination of combos that we thought we knew and almost kind of tunnel vision them into certain Link monsters. Isolde, Summon Sorceress, Halqifibrax, Firewall Dragon, Nightmare Goblin, to end board monsters like Gumbler Dragon. Whether you had two warriors or a tuner plus a non-tuner, Link climbing took over the game with the ease of access and the payoff for such low resource investment. The 1-2 card combos that we knew with decks from Inzectors and windups all the way until Zodiac changed with just how much decks seem to focus on these certain Link monsters, a trait that still hinders certain decks today, even after the introduction of Master Rule 5. With part of the picture painted, before I get into Master Rule 5, I would like to talk about the steady uptick in use of hand traps, along with going second cards, and cards that we got during Master Rule 4, that would shape the game that we know today in Master Rule 5. Shifter, Nibiru, Dark Ruler, Lightning Storm, and evenly matched with multiple copies of Super Poly would forever change how we look at deck building and how we looked at formats heading into them. With hand traps already having an abundance of cards without even mentioning the introduction of other Ghost Girls besides Ash Blossom, now we had Board Breaker, which meant no deck was safe entering the game from those cards unless they could specifically play around them. Slowly but surely, deck building and theory became a much more integral part of the game. In the span of 3 years, how we went second to combat the power of going first was facelifted with the introduction of new cards, the banning of Max C in the TCG, and the unbanning of cards like Raigeki and Harpy's Feather Duster. In that time span, we also got Called by the Grave, a card that was meant to combat hand traps specifically, though it did much more than that. Going on to Master Rule 5, with all of these new generic cards being as powerful as they were, we were also introduced to certain cards that almost felt like they were from GOAT format. Chaos Ruler, Triple Tactics Talent, all the way up to where we were now with the release of cards and archetypes like Kit Kalos and Tearlaments, with Arise Heart and Kashtira, and of course Bystials. And I only mention them like GOAT format cards just because of the sheer power they had as singular cards. Of course, what they did was more suited to the modern game. Not only were archetypes and themes becoming much more competent in what they did and how often they could do it, with the current arsenal of going second cards, we entered an unprecedented power level in this game's history. Before we knew it, gathering resources to create your opening became Open X Starter, build one of a handful of boards, and hope your opponent didn't open into their going second blowout card. Early in Master Rule 5, which was right around the time the pandemic started, the game ceased and desisted on ban lists. Maybe not entirely, but moves were much smaller to start. With the release of new archetypes, we also saw diversity in archetypes reach levels only very few formats were capable of, if any. I'd argue that the local level, where we have decks like Galaxy or Sharks, to the increasing number with the support for decks like Volcanics and Battle and Boxer that were recently released, we've never had this much diversity. So now you must be wondering, how does any of this make Yu-Gi-Oh! Polarizing? With optimized strategies predicated on tunneling through specific lines of play and an arsenal of going second cards that make both going first and second vulnerable to auto losses depending on certain factors like the format, deck building, and even dumb luck, decks that have a consistent strategy locked into wanting to do a lot of the same things over and over again, whether it be special summon Kashtira Unicorn, add Papayas, or find a way to make Kit Kalos with Tearlaments, the optimization of the game could very well be attributed to a lot of the non-games that we currently have in Yu-Gi-Oh! As more themes have come out, cards like Maxi, Droll Lockbird, Dimension Shifter, etc. will only get stronger. The amount of non-games created by cards like that is something that's reared its head more and more over the course of Master Rule 5, and how frequent they are is what has made this game polarizing. I think there's a consensus that while unbreakable boards are bad for the game, so are turn-ending hand traps, or game-winning board breakers. That said, there are people who believe them to be necessary evils, and if you want my opinion on that, you'll have to wait just a bit longer. Another thing that has to be mentioned is long card text, and the more effects a card has, the more these themes can execute their strategy, assuming those cards are meant to help said strategy. Something that may scare new players, but it's not really all that bad, is a million end up doing like 2 to 4 things. Once you know those 2 to 4 things, it's pretty easy. That is, until PSCT, and that's also known as problem-solving card text. The more effects a card has, and the more new cards come out, the more interactions will enter the game. While it's definitely not always a bad thing, it does create a barrier to learning the game. Just don't think things like speed duels or rush duels are good substitutes either. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game that in large part has made a living from its nostalgia. The anime had a cultural impact on many people who still play and spend a lot today, and deviating from that is not something I think that the broader audience really cares about. My next reason as to why Yu-Gi-Oh! Is polarizing is just that, it's a broader audience. Yu-Gi-Oh!'s card game is a bit more unique in regards to its competition. Yu-Gi-Oh! Was the next big thing after Pokemon 20 or so years ago. We're publicly focused on learning its card game, and sure, it sold packs, but its Game Boy games and the anime were what really popped off for Pokemon. Card collection was big, but most people didn't even know how to play the game. Magic is a game that kept its relevance for specifically being a popular card game. While some people may only compare Yu-Gi-Oh! To other card games because of its broader popularity, there will always be people who expect more from it, extending beyond just card games. Nostalgic players learn about the evolution of the game and the current paradox of Yu-Gi-Oh! Non-games via long turns or seemingly short turns halted by a single card. It can bring a sense of anticlimactic gameplay, resulting in some of the toxicity we see from players online and occasionally even in real life. People want to be able to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And I've heard different proposals like taking previous formats seriously or introducing set rotation. I think much like our gameplay currently, that might be a little bit too drastic. I want to tie in some things together now in regards to how some players may feel towards cards that they consider to be necessary evils like Shifter and Droll. Cards like Harpy's Feather Duster or Evenly for back row decks is another example of this. Optimizing archetypes like Kashtira and Sprite, and then locking them into lines of play to create a more predictable gameplay loop, in turns makes specifically prepping for them while deck building easier as long as you have knowledge of the card pool. Another point that shows that the learning barrier that this game has. But to the original point, if the Kashtira player uses Shifter in the draw phase, they protect themselves from Droll. The Kashtira player can also just not draw Shifter and have his turn end to a Droll depending on what their hand is. Countering one extreme with another isn't the right way to approach this in my opinion. Konami over the last few years have shown the ability to make slower paced decks that retain their power through advantage. Some may combo for 3-4 minutes, others may have surprisingly short turns. Decks like Marincess or even a more recent example, the Illusion Chimera deck that we have on the screen, while retaining some of that predictable gameplay loop I was talking about earlier, do a good job at providing interaction when both decks are just playing with in-engine cards. To make Yu-Gi-Oh! A less polarizing game, we need a less polarizing ban list, and less polarizing objectives for win conditions. Mind Hacker, Shang Tsung, Arise Heart was about as fun as Hot Red King Calamity. Notoriety for non-games shouldn't be waited several months and even years to hit cards. Master Duels and the OCG still have Max C, and the TCG have waited far too long for bannings of cards like Scythe and Mystic Mine. We've had too many formats in this game's history where we're just a few bans away from engaging formats, and Konami just refuses refuses to do it. This game to be less polarizing, we need swift and faster decisions, and to make the focal point of the interactions come from the cards within said archetypes. Optimizing gameplay to the point things almost feel premeditated can ruin the feel for competitive players, and ultimately gets old for new players that get experienced in the game. In some ways, deck building being almost like a sport in itself with how much mental gymnastics is done to combat the format and card pull, but without the reward of good gameplay, you'll have many games feel like they were rewarded just because you played one of the most popular cards of the format. I guess the TLDR is, one extreme shouldn't be used to combat another. Optimization in deck design makes a large portion of gameplay predictable, which will automatically turn some people off, and the refusal to implement the ban list timely and correctly only further draws the ire of the player base, especially because it's an expensive game that has a reputation amongst players of ruining some people's wallets. Lastly, promoting archetypes should be done with their gimmicks and interacting with each other. An archetype hand traps are not the move, as they'll become redundant, further feeding into the more predictable gameplay. I guess maybe there is one last thing that could be seen as polarizing when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh!, and that is some of the artwork. The game made its name off of mythical creatures with vague lines of vanilla flavor text that gave you an idea of what their backstory was. Nowadays, their card arts like Sky Strikers, Marine Cess, Trap Tricks, and the new Centurion cards even, just to name a few, that would have landed Konami on a watch list many years ago. Even if the strategies are fun to some, they don't appeal to a much broader audience, which is what Konami seems to aim for every time we get new sets meant to feed on nostalgia. Admittedly, I'm a boomer, but I've also had trouble getting people to take this game seriously because of stuff like that. Only one person who plays the game at a very casual level that I've reintroduced into the game, predictably, to myself at least, just gone about it as if those decks don't even exist unless they happen to run into them online. While it can be said everyone will have their own cup of tea in regards to the type of cards we get, it's hard to not acknowledge the jokes made about some of these archetypes either. Just shudder at the idea of 9-10-year-olds looking at young adults calling Labyrinth cards mommy, and then same 9-10-year-old looking back at their mommy like mommy. And while that may be a joke, the point is that for Yu-Gi-Oh! To become a less polarizing game, we need some level of conforming by Konami. Seeing cool gimmicks and themes will always be what keeps this game going. As people grow more tired of the non-moves Konami makes in regards to how they adjust to some of these complaints, or just how long it takes to solve them, it's fair to wonder how the player base will react after maybe just another decade. I can vouch that the tolerance level of some of these things in 2020 are much lower than 2010s, with things like social media really taking off, and more voices being allowed to sound on their opinions. With all of that said, what are your thoughts? Should extreme versus extreme continue to be the norm in Yu-Gi-Oh? How do you feel ban list and gameplay strategies should be handled? Do you think optimization is good or bad for the game after hearing my thoughts? Let me know all of that down below. As for those who've made it this far, I thank you so much for watching and for the 600 plus subs. I truly appreciate your support. Now that we've monetized the channel, giving us access to supers and memberships, more awesome stuff is on the horizon. To get the channel membership, just click on the description below and there will be a link that takes you there. You'll also notice a free Discord link that I've made for us too. If you want to support me as a content creator, even if you can't donate supers or get a membership for the channel, clicking on those thumbs up and subscribe buttons help a lot too. For those wondering, I do plan on making updates to the channel as the support on the channel grows. Anyways, I hope to see you on the next one. It's Bones, signing out.